Sometimes a single moment, one choice made in haste, can change the course of a lifetime. He offered help when she needed it most, but pride and pressure made her push him away. Years later, in a place far from where it all began, fate quietly placed them in each other's path again. But by then, both had scars the other could not see. And sometimes it's not just the past we must forgive, but ourselves. Before we begin this heartwarming journey of second chances and healing, if you enjoy inspiring love stories filled with hope, kindness, and the beauty of new beginnings, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that touch the heart. Now let's step into a story where even broken roads can lead to something beautiful. The sun hung low over Willow Creek, painting the modest little town in molten gold. Strings of white paper lanterns crisscrossed Main Street, swaying gently in the late afternoon breeze. Neighbors gathered in small clusters outside storefronts, dressed in their Sunday best, murmuring in excitement. Today wasn't just any Saturday. It was the wedding everyone had been talking about for months. Charlotte Lottie Davenport, the beloved daughter of one of Willow Creek's oldest, wealthiest families, was set to marry Preston Whitmore, a polished man whose family fortune stretched further than the cornfields surrounding the town. For most, it was a perfect match, a storybook romance, a merging of legacies, or so it seemed. Evan Carter wiped the grease from his hands with a rag already stained from years of hard labor. He stood just outside Carter's auto, the modest garage his late father had built with bare hands and stubborn dreams. Evan's gaze drifted toward the commotion down the street, where a pristine white convertible, adorned with fresh lilies and satin ribbons, coasted gracefully toward the town square. Until it didn't. With a harsh sputter and a reluctant hiss, the car shuddered to a stop right in front of Miller's General Store. The driver's panicked attempts to restart the engine were met with a sickening clunk, followed by a dead, miserable silence. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Inside the car, Lottie's veil fluttered in the breeze, a perfect contrast against her flowing lace gown. She leaned forward, speaking hurriedly to the driver. From Evan's distance, he couldn't hear the words, but the anxiety in her movements was unmistakable. Something stirred deep in his chest, a memory of his father's quiet creed. If you see someone stranded, you help, no matter who, no matter what. Without hesitation, Evan tossed the rag aside and crossed the street in long strides. His boots echoed against the cracked pavement. Some heads turned. A few whispers floated on the air. But Evan kept his focus on the distressed bride. He approached the front of the stalled car, tapping lightly on the hood with the back of his hand. "Looks like it's overheated," he said, offering a polite, gentle smile. "If you pop the hood, I can take a quick look. Shouldn't take more than a minute." For a heartbeat, there was a silence so thick it drowned out the murmurs around them. Lottie turned to look at him fully for the first time. Up close, Evan could see the delicate features behind the veil, the high cheekbones, the wide, sea-glass green eyes. For a moment, their gazes locked, and something uncertain flickered in hers. But then a bridesmaid, clutching a glittery clutch and wearing a scowl, leaned in and hissed something into Lottie's ear. Lottie's expression hardened. She leaned away from the wheel and waved her hand dismissively, as if shooing away a bothersome insect. "We're fine, thank you," she said loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Please, don't touch anything. We wouldn't want grease stains on the dress or the car." The words hit Evan harder than he expected. The tone, sharp, cool, dismissive, cut through him cleaner than any wrench slip ever had. A few people chuckled awkwardly. Someone near the general store whispered, "Should have known better." Heat rose to Evan's cheeks. He nodded once, curtly, swallowing whatever pride was left sticking to his ribs. "Of course," he said quietly, stepping back, giving a slight nod. "Best wishes to you." Without another glance, Lottie turned her attention back to the driver, who was already fumbling for his phone. Evan retreated, each step heavier than the last, feeling 1,000 invisible eyes on his back. He didn't see the slight tremble in Lottie's hand as she pushed a strand of hair behind her ear. He didn't see the way her eyes lingered, just for a moment, on his retreating figure. Something conflicted, almost regretful, shadowing her gaze. Within minutes, a private chauffeur from Davenport Enterprises arrived, a shiny black Escalade idling at the curb. Lottie gathered her skirts and slipped into the back seat without so much as a backward glance. The townsfolk watched as the Escalade rolled away, leaving the broken-down convertible behind, and Evan standing like a forgotten footnote to a story he was never meant to belong to. He turned without a word and walked back toward his garage. Behind him, the celebration resumed. Laughter, applause, the chiming of church bells echoing in the warm afternoon air. But for Evan Carter, the sound might as well have been 1,000 miles away. He wiped his hands again, out of habit more than necessity, and ducked back into the dimness of the garage. He leaned against the workbench, the smell of motor oil and worn leather grounding him. In the corner, the old radio crackled to life, playing a faded country ballad about broken dreams and long, dusty roads. Evan closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deep. It wasn't the first time life had reminded him where he stood. It probably wouldn't be the last. Still, a part of him, quiet and stubborn, refused to let bitterness take root. Maybe, he thought, some people were born for fairy tales, and maybe others were simply meant to keep the engines running. Either way, the sun would rise again tomorrow, and Evan Carter would still be here, wrench in hand, heart intact, ready to help the next soul that needed saving. Even if they didn't see him, even if they never said thank you. The chapel doors swung open with a soft groan, and a hush fell over the gathered crowd. Lottie stood at the threshold, bathed in the golden light streaming through the high-arched windows. Her gown shimmered with intricate beading, her veil flowing like spun sugar behind her. To everyone in the pews, she was the picture of a perfect bride, radiant, poised, and breathtaking. But inside, Lottie felt nothing. She clutched the bouquet tighter, her knuckles whitening beneath delicate lace gloves. Her heart, instead of soaring, sat heavy and unmoving in her chest. It was a curious, hollow sensation, like staring out over a vast ocean and realizing there was no land on the other side. Preston stood at the altar, tall and commanding in his tailored tuxedo. His smile was wide, but to Lottie, it didn't quite reach his eyes. It never had, if she were honest with herself. The organist began the traditional march. Lottie's father offered his arm, beaming with pride, and together they stepped into the aisle. Heads turned, cameras flashed. A collective sigh of admiration rippled through the guests. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The perfect Davenport-Whitmore union, the social event of the year. Step by step, Lottie moved forward, each footfall feeling heavier than the last. She forced her mind to stay present, but it wandered despite her efforts. She thought of Evan Carter, the mechanic with the earnest eyes and the calloused hands, standing in the sunlight, offering help without hesitation. She had seen the hurt flash across his face when she turned him away. It shouldn't matter, she told herself. He was a stranger, a nobody. Yet somehow the image of him lingered, stubborn as a burr caught in the fabric of her mind. At the altar, Preston reached out for her hand. His grip was firm, almost possessive. Lottie managed a tight smile as the minister began to speak, his words echoing through the cavernous space. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." The ceremony unfolded like a play she had memorized but never auditioned for. Vows were spoken, rings exchanged. Cheers erupted as the minister declared them husband and wife. Preston kissed her, quick, efficient, impersonal. The guests clapped and whistled, rising to their feet in applause. Lottie smiled dutifully for the cameras, for the town, for her parents' beaming faces. Inside, something small and precious curled up and died. The reception was held at Davenport Manor, an opulent estate perched on the hill overlooking Willow Creek. A grand tent had been erected on the sprawling lawn, festooned with crystal chandeliers and silk drapes. Tables groaned under the weight of extravagant floral arrangements and catered delicacies. Lottie moved among the guests like a ghost, exchanging pleasantries, accepting congratulations, posing for photographs. Preston was never far from her side, but his attention was divided, checking his phone, laughing a little too loudly with business associates, flashing his polished smile to anyone deemed important enough. At one point, while she stood alone by the champagne fountain, Lottie overheard two women whispering behind gloved hands. Heard she only married him because her family pressured her. Poor thing, looks miserable. "Oh, don't be naive," the other woman said with a laugh. Miserable or not, she secured herself quite the future. Lottie turned away, the bubbles in her champagne glass blurring into a watery haze. She sought refuge outside, escaping the suffocating tent and the shallow conversations. The evening air was cool, carrying the faint scent of honeysuckle and freshly mown grass. She wandered down the gravel path toward the gardens, where lanterns hung low among the trees, casting pools of soft light. Standing there under the canopy of ancient oaks, she finally allowed herself a moment of honesty. She didn't love Preston. She had never loved him. She loved the idea of what he represented: stability, acceptance, a life free from the uncertainty that had always terrified her. She had agreed to this marriage because it was expected, because it was easier than disappointing everyone who had ever laid out a plan for her life. But easy wasn't the same as right. And no amount of silk and lace could hide the truth pressing against her ribcage: that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. A movement near the hedges caught her eye. Evan. No, not Evan. Just a groundskeeper in a dusty cap, tending to the lanterns. Still, the phantom of Evan's presence lingered, stirring something raw and aching inside her. Back in the tent, Preston's voice boomed as he gave a charming, practiced toast, thanking everyone for their support. Lottie rejoined the party, plastering on her brightest smile, playing her role to perfection. Inside, her heart sat like a stone. Later that night, after the last slice of wedding cake had been served and the final guests had departed, Lottie sat at the vanity in the bridal suite, staring at her reflection. The heavy tiara dug into her scalp. The makeup felt like a mask cracking at the edges. Preston entered, already unbuttoning his cuffs, talking about honeymoon plans, business meetings he couldn't postpone, deals too important to leave unattended. His voice was brisk, distracted. He didn't notice the tear that slipped down her cheek, or if he did, he didn't care. Lottie turned back to the mirror, and for the first time in her life, she saw herself not as others saw her, but as she truly was. Not a princess, not a trophy, not a possession, just a woman sitting alone in a white dress, wondering how she had ended up here. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered, "It's not too late." But for tonight, she had no strength left to answer it. The days that followed the wedding blurred into a haze of obligation. Lottie moved through them like an actress, trapped in a role she no longer remembered auditioning for. The Davenport-Whitmore marriage had become the talk of Willow Creek, lauded in local papers, whispered about in hair salons and church pews. Outwardly, everything gleamed with the perfect shine of success. Photographs of the newlyweds smiling at charity galas and business dinners adorned the society pages. Lottie's parents received congratulatory letters from acquaintances they hadn't spoken to in years. But inside the Grand Whitmore estate, a different reality festered. Preston was gone more often than he was present. Late nights at the office, urgent trips out of town, endless networking events. When he was home, he was distracted, tethered to his phone, barking orders at assistants, his affections reduced to absent-minded pecks on the cheek and hollow reassurances. Lottie learned to fill her days with small, numbing routines, arranging fresh flowers in the sitting room, organizing charity events she cared little about, attending luncheons where conversation never strayed beyond designer brands and property values. She told herself she was building a life, a real life, just as everyone had expected. But with each passing week, the hollow ache inside her grew harder to ignore. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when Lottie's world finally cracked wide open. She had driven to Preston's downtown office, a stack of signed documents he had forgotten sitting on the passenger seat. Determined to surprise him, and maybe foolishly, to feel needed, she parked by the curb and hurried inside, rain spotting her cream-colored coat. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly sculpted nails and a strained smile, barely looked up as Lottie entered. "I'm here to drop these off for Preston," Lottie said, forcing brightness into her voice. The receptionist hesitated, her eyes flickering briefly with something like discomfort. "Mr. Whitmore is in a meeting." "That's fine," Lottie said easily. "I'll just leave these on his desk." Without waiting for permission, she stepped past the desk, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. The office smelled of expensive leather and cold ambition. As she approached Preston's private suite, she heard voices, low, intimate, laughing. She paused, hand hovering near the door. Another laugh, a woman's this time, light and flirtatious, followed by Preston's unmistakable chuckle. Then a murmur, something tender, a sound Lottie knew too well. Her stomach twisted violently. She pushed the door open without knocking. Inside, Preston stood behind his desk, his tie loosened, one hand resting intimately on the waist of a tall, blonde woman Lottie had seen at more than one corporate function. The woman's hand was on Preston's chest, her expression smug, possessive. For a split second, no one moved. Time, it seemed, dared not breathe. Preston's eyes widened, his mouth opening as if to spin a lie, a half-truth, something. But there was no salvaging what lay bare before them. The stack of documents slipped from Lottie's hands, scattering across the Persian rug like broken promises. "I see," Lottie said, her voice remarkably steady. "Don't let me interrupt." She turned and walked away before she could hear whatever excuse Preston scrambled to invent. Each step away from that room felt like peeling back a layer of her own skin. Raw, excruciating, inevitable. Lottie didn't remember driving home. Didn't remember tossing her keys onto the marble countertop or shedding her rain-soaked coat onto the floor. She only remembered standing in the middle of the cavernous, soulless kitchen, trembling with the enormity of it all. It wasn't just Preston's betrayal that gutted her. It was the shattering of every illusion she had clung to. About love, about security, about herself. She had traded pieces of her soul for this gilded life, believing it would be enough, believing that if she followed the path laid out for her, happiness would eventually follow. Now, staring at the cold emptiness around her, she realized how deeply, tragically wrong she had been. Tears slipped down her cheeks unchecked. Not graceful, dignified tears, but messy, broken sobs that racked her slender frame and stole the breath from her lungs. When the storm inside her finally abated, Lottie found herself sitting on the cold tile floor, her back against the stainless steel refrigerator. Her wedding ring, heavy and alien on her finger, caught the light. Without thinking, she slid it off and placed it beside her on the floor. It gleamed mockingly under the kitchen's recessed lights. That night, Lottie made a decision. She packed a single suitcase, essentials only. She left her wedding dress hanging in the closet, a relic of a life she no longer claimed. On the marble island, she scrawled a simple note: "I deserve better." No explanations, no dramatic farewells, just the truth. She called a cab, giving the driver the address of a modest motel on the outskirts of town, somewhere anonymous, somewhere unremarkable. As the cab pulled away from the grand estate, Lottie stared out the window, watching the only life she had ever known recede into the rain-soaked darkness. She felt no fear, only the quiet, flickering flame of something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Freedom. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the storybook ending people had scripted for her. But it was hers. And for the first time in years, Lottie felt the faint stirrings of hope. The town of Maple Hollow greeted Lottie with a quiet indifference. It wasn't unfriendly exactly, just used to its own rhythms, its own familiar faces. Maple Hollow wasn't listed on glossy travel brochures. It had no grand monuments, no luxury resorts. Just a cluster of modest homes with white picket fences, a single main street lined with mom-and-pop stores, and an old clock tower that hadn't kept proper time in years. To Lottie, it felt like another planet. She stepped out of the cab, clutching her suitcase, the early morning air crisp against her cheeks. Her shoes clicked hesitantly on the cracked sidewalk as she surveyed the surroundings. A diner with neon letters half burned out, a hardware store boasting everything you need since 1953, and across the street, a tiny bookstore tucked between a barbershop and a bakery. It was there, through the bookstore's fogged windows, that Lottie saw a flicker of warmth she hadn't realized she was desperate for. Shelves packed tight with old novels, a golden retriever napping by the counter, and a woman with silver hair laughing as she rang up a customer. Something deep in Lottie's chest, brittle and bruised, stirred. Maybe, she thought, she could start again here. Maybe she had to. The motel wasn't much to look at. A two-story rectangle painted a tired beige, its parking lot littered with fallen leaves. But the room was clean enough. Lottie set her suitcase down and perched on the edge of the bed, listening to the hum of the outdated air conditioner. For a long moment, she simply sat there. No obligations, no lavish events to attend. No one expecting her to smile, to perform, to pretend. The quiet was deafening. But beneath it, there was also an odd, tentative sense of relief. A blank canvas. Lottie unpacked the essentials, a few changes of clothes, a battered copy of Pride and Prejudice she had carried since college, a framed photo of her mother and herself, smiling in a sunnier time. She set the photo on the nightstand and sat back. "All right," she whispered to the empty room. "Time to figure out who you really are." The next morning, after a restless night tangled in motel sheets, Lottie found herself standing in front of Maple Hollow Books. A handwritten sign in the window read, "Help wanted, part-time clerk, must love books." Lottie hesitated, her fingers curling against the strap of her purse. Back in Willow Creek, she had attended charity galas with authors and sat on the boards of literary foundations. She had never worked a cash register or dusted shelves. But this wasn't Willow Creek anymore, and she wasn't that woman anymore. Taking a breath, she pushed the door open. A small bell above the frame jingled cheerfully. Inside, the bookstore smelled of old paper and cinnamon, a scent so comforting it nearly buckled her knees. Sunlight spilled across creaky wooden floors. Books towered in gentle chaos along every wall, and the golden retriever lifted its head lazily to regard her before thumping its tail once in welcome. Behind the counter, the woman with silver hair smiled. "Morning," she said warmly. "Looking for something special?" Lottie swallowed, nerves tangling in her stomach. "Actually, I saw the sign. About the job?" The woman's smile widened, crinkling the corners of her kind blue eyes. "Well, aren't you a sight for sore eyes? I'm Edie, owner, manager, and sometimes janitor. And you are?" "Lottie," she said, the name tasting strange but good in her mouth, new and clean. "Well, Lottie," Edie said, stepping out from behind the counter. "Do you love books?" "I do," Lottie said softly. "Very much." Edie chuckled. "That's half the battle. Can you alphabetize?" Lottie laughed, really laughed, for the first time in what felt like years. "I think I can manage." "Good enough for me," Edie said, handing her a dust rag. "Let's get to it." The first few days at the bookstore were a kind of therapy Lottie hadn't known she needed. There was something soothing about the simplicity of it. Wiping down shelves, ringing up paperbacks, helping a child pick out their first chapter book. Edie, it turned out, had a sharp wit and a tender heart. She asked no prying questions, content to let Lottie reveal pieces of herself in her own time. In the evenings, Lottie would return to her motel room, exhausted but strangely content. She ate takeout from the diner across the street, curled up with old novels, and fell asleep to the soft hum of the town outside her window. Each day, the weight on her chest grew a little lighter. Each day, she remembered a little more how to breathe. One afternoon, about a week after she started at the bookstore, Lottie lingered outside on her lunch break, sipping a cup of coffee from the bakery next door. The town square stretched out before her, a small park with a fountain, a few benches, maple trees just beginning to hint at their autumn colors. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't grand, but it was real, and for the first time in a long time, so was she. A beat-up pickup truck rumbled by on the street, and Lottie glanced up absently. Her heart skipped a beat. The man behind the wheel looked familiar, broad-shouldered with dark tousled hair and a worn work shirt rolled up at the sleeves. His face, weathered by sun and time, was half hidden behind a pair of sunglasses. But there was something unmistakably kind about the way he carried himself. He didn't see her as he passed by, focused on the road ahead. But Lottie stood frozen on the sidewalk, coffee cooling in her hand, a strange electric feeling prickling at the edges of her consciousness. It couldn't be, she thought. It was impossible. And yet, somewhere deep in her bones, she knew. It was him, the mechanic, the one she had turned away on her wedding day, the man she had humiliated and abandoned in a moment she now regretted more than she could say. Fate, it seemed, wasn't finished with her yet. The next few days passed in a strange haze for Lottie. Every time she stepped outside the bookstore, every time she glanced across Maple Hollow's sleepy streets, she half expected to see him, the mechanic from her past, the man whose face haunted her with equal parts guilt and wonder. And yet, for a while, he was nowhere. It made her wonder if she had imagined it, the flicker of recognition, the gut-deep certainty that fate had spun their paths together once more. Maybe it was just wishful thinking. Or maybe, she thought, it was a second chance she hadn't yet earned. It was a Saturday morning when their paths collided again. The town square buzzed with life for the Maple Hollow Fall Festival. Booths lined the sidewalks, offering homemade pies, knitted scarves, and steaming cups of apple cider. Children darted between stalls with painted faces, and the air was thick with the scent of cinnamon and wood smoke. Edie had roped Lottie into helping with the bookstore's booth, setting up tables stacked with used paperbacks and colorful bookmarks. Lottie tied an apron around her waist, laughing as she struggled to corral a tower of mystery novels threatening to topple. "You're a natural," Edie teased, passing her a mug of cider. "You ever think about a career in literary chaos?" Lottie smiled, her heart light. For the first time, she felt like she belonged somewhere. She was smoothing out a tablecloth when she felt it. That subtle shift in the air, as if the whole world had drawn in a breath and held it. She looked up, and there he was, standing across the square, examining a booth selling handmade wooden furniture, was the man she had glimpsed from the sidewalk days ago. Up close, there was no mistaking him. The rugged jawline, the calloused hands, the quiet strength in his posture. Evan Carter. The name tumbled through her mind, knocking the breath from her lungs. He was wearing a simple denim jacket and worn jeans, his dark hair tousled by the breeze. He looked older than she remembered, more grounded, more real. There was a kind of weathered peace about him, the sort that only came from surviving storms. Lottie's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. What was she supposed to do? Pretend not to see him? Hide behind the stacks of books and pray he walked away? But as she stood frozen, Evan glanced up, and their eyes met. It was like the world narrowed to just the two of them, the festival noise fading into a distant hum. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then Evan blinked, his expression unreadable, and turned back to the booth, as if nothing had happened. Lottie's heart ached. She hadn't expected forgiveness, but she hadn't been prepared for indifference either. The day dragged on, each hour heavier than the last. Lottie helped sell books, laughed at children's antics, complimented hand-knit scarves, but part of her mind remained stuck in that moment. Had he really not recognized her? Or worse, had he recognized her and simply chosen to forget? Near the end of the afternoon, as the crowds began to thin and the golden light of early evening painted the world in soft amber, Lottie took a break. She wandered toward the fountain at the center of the square, clutching a cup of cider now gone cold. She sat on the low stone ledge, watching leaves tumble across the grass. Behind her, footsteps approached. She didn't need to turn to know it was him. There was a weight to his presence, a solidity that made the air feel different, charged. "Mind if I sit?" The voice was low, familiar, and so much rougher than she remembered. Lottie swallowed hard and nodded without trusting her voice. Evan lowered himself onto the ledge beside her, leaving a careful space between them. For a while, neither spoke. Lottie stared into the fountain's rippling water, searching for courage she wasn't sure she had. Finally, it was Evan who broke the silence. "I thought it was you," he said, his tone even, almost casual. "Wasn't sure if you'd want me to say anything." She turned to him then, and her heart clenched. There was no bitterness in his eyes, only a quiet sadness, tempered by something gentler. Understanding, maybe, or resignation. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling, "for what I did, for how I treated you." Evan gave a small, wry smile. "You were having a rough day. Weddings'll do that." Lottie shook her head fiercely. "It wasn't just a rough day, it was—" She faltered, words piling up behind the dam of shame. "It was wrong. I was wrong." The honesty hung between them, raw and painful. Evan looked away toward the fading sun dipping behind the trees. "People make mistakes," he said finally, "some bigger than others. But you're here now. That's got to mean something." Lottie blinked against the sting in her eyes. "I didn't expect—" She trailed off. "I didn't expect you to be kind." He shrugged one shoulder. "Doesn't cost anything." They sat there a while longer, the easy bustle of the festival washing over them like a river they were content to watch from the shore. Finally, Evan stood, brushing dust from his jeans. "Take care of yourself, Lottie," he said, his voice soft but sure. Then he turned and walked away, boots crunching on the gravel path. Lottie watched him go, a strange mix of regret and hope swirling in her chest. She wasn't sure if it was an ending or a beginning, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She didn't want to let this second chance slip through her fingers. Not again. The days after the festival unfolded like the slow, careful turning of a fragile page. Lottie threw herself into her work at the bookstore. She alphabetized paperbacks with obsessive precision, dusted every forgotten corner, and meticulously arranged window displays with seasonal themes. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, real. At night, she would sit by the tiny window of her motel room, a worn blanket wrapped around her shoulders, sipping tea as the town settled into its quiet rhythm outside. And always, always, her mind circled back to Evan. Their conversation at the fountain had left a mark, gentle yet indelible. He had every right to hate her, but he hadn't. Instead, he had offered something far rarer. Grace. Lottie didn't know how to repay that, but she knew she didn't want that moment to be the last word between them. One morning, as Lottie swept the front stoop of the bookstore, Edie leaned against the doorframe, a mug of coffee in hand. "You're looking better these days, hun," Edie said, her voice warm. "Got a little color back in those cheeks." Lottie smiled faintly. "Maybe this town has magic in it." Edie chuckled. "Maple Hollow doesn't have magic, sugar. It's just got good people who mind their own business and leave a light on for the ones who lose their way." Lottie felt a lump rise in her throat. She blinked it back quickly. "You ever think about putting down roots here?" Edie asked casually. The question caught her off guard. Put down roots? The idea had once seemed absurd, laughable even. But now, here in this little corner of the world, the notion didn't terrify her the way it used to. "I'm thinking about it," Lottie admitted, her voice soft. "Good," Edie said, patting her arm. "The world needs more folks who know what it feels like to start over." Later that afternoon, fate, or maybe Providence, intervened again. A delivery truck sputtered to a halt in front of the bookstore, the driver hopping out and waving apologetically. "Sorry, ma'am," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "Flat tire. Can't budge it without some help." Before Lottie could respond, a familiar beat-up pickup truck pulled alongside the curb. Evan climbed out, his work boots hitting the pavement with a soft thud. "Need a hand?" he called out, casual but commanding. The driver gratefully accepted, and within moments Evan was kneeling by the disabled truck, his hands working deftly with the tire iron. Lottie watched from the doorway, heart thudding. After the tire was replaced and the delivery truck rumbled away, Evan wiped his hands on a rag and turned toward her. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the early autumn sunlight casting long shadows between them. "You're handy to have around," Lottie said, offering a tentative smile. Evan chuckled, the sound low and genuine. "Old habits die hard." There was an awkward beat, thick with unsaid things. And then, impulsively, recklessly, Lottie spoke. "Would you like to come in? For coffee, maybe. It's terrible coffee, but it's warm." Evan hesitated, glancing at his truck, at the open road that would be so easy to retreat down. But then he looked back at her, really looked, and something in his expression softened. "Sure," he said. "I could use terrible coffee." Inside, Lottie poured 2 mismatched mugs and slid one across the counter to him. They stood there for a while, sipping in companionable silence. Around them, the bookstore breathed its familiar, comforting scent of old paper and sunshine. The golden retriever, named Scout, as Lottie had learned, snored gently by the register. Lottie found herself relaxing in Evan's presence in a way she hadn't with anyone in years. "So," Evan said finally, setting his mug down, "what brought you to Maple Hollow?" It wasn't an accusation, just a simple, open question. Lottie turned the mug between her palms, the warmth seeping into her skin. "I needed to start over," she said carefully. "I made a lot of mistakes. I hurt people. I lost sight of who I was." Evan didn't flinch. He didn't rush to fill the silence or offer hollow reassurances. He just nodded, like he understood. And somehow, that was exactly what she needed. "What about you?" she asked. "What brought you here?" Evan shrugged, a small self-deprecating smile tugging at his mouth. "After my old man passed, I needed a fresh start too. Found work at the garage out by the highway. Good people. Honest work." Lottie smiled. "Sounds like you found your place." He met her gaze steadily. "Still figuring it out. But yeah, it's getting there." Their eyes held for a long, quiet moment. And for the first time, Lottie let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she could find her place too. When Evan finally rose to leave, he lingered at the door. You ever need a hand with anything, he said, jerking a thumb toward the bookstore shelves. You know where to find me. Lottie smiled, her heart lifting in a way she hadn't thought possible. Thanks, Evan. I mean it. He tipped an imaginary hat, a twinkle in his eye, and stepped into the fading afternoon light. As the door swung shut behind him, Lottie pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the fragile flutter of something precious and new. Not love, not yet, but hope. And that, she thought, was enough for now. The October mornings in Maple Hollow came crisp and cool, tinged with the scent of burning leaves and the faint promise of winter. Lottie woke earlier these days, her mind clearer than it had been in years. There was a steadiness in her routine now, tidying shelves, brewing coffee, chatting with Edie and Scout at the bookstore. Yet lately there was an undercurrent of anticipation threading through her days. It had everything to do with a certain mechanic with quiet eyes and a steady smile. It began with little things. One morning, Evan stopped by with a box of donated books from a church rummage sale. Another afternoon, he helped her fix the loose hinge on the bookstore's front door without being asked, whistling softly under his breath as he worked. Lottie found herself looking for excuses to linger in conversation, asking about carburetors she barely understood, feigning interest in tire rotations. Evan, for his part, answered every question with patient, thoughtful simplicity, never once talking down to her. He didn't fill silences with noise. He didn't demand explanations or pry into the parts of her past she wasn't ready to share. He just showed up, steady, reliable, like a lighthouse in the fog. One Saturday afternoon, as the low sun bathed Maple Hollow in gold, Lottie found herself facing a practical dilemma. Her old sedan, already wheezing from years of neglect, refused to start in the bookstore parking lot. She jiggled the keys, muttered a prayer, even gave the dashboard a light smack. Nothing. She was peering hopelessly under the hood, more for show than any real mechanical knowledge, when Evan's truck pulled up beside her. He leaned out the window, one eyebrow raised in amusement. Need a hand? Lottie laughed, stepping back with a theatrical flourish. Be my guest. Evan hopped down from the truck, toolbox in hand. Within minutes, he was poking around the engine with the easy familiarity of a man who spoke fluent machinery. Lottie hovered nearby, hands stuffed awkwardly into the pockets of her jacket. I'm afraid I'm useless when it comes to cars. Evan smiled without looking up. You're not useless. You just haven't learned yet. The words, said so matter-of-factly, hit her harder than they should have. He didn't see her as broken or weak, just unfinished. Teach me? She blurted, surprising even herself. Evan straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. You serious? She nodded, cheeks flushing. I want to learn. I'm tired of being the kind of person who just waits around for someone else to fix things. For a long moment he studied her, something warm and almost proud flickering in his gaze. All right, he said. Lesson 1. Pop the hood without looking like you're afraid it'll bite you. Lottie laughed, the sound light and free, and stepped forward. That afternoon became the first of many small lessons. They started with basics: how to check oil levels, how to listen for certain engine sounds, how to recognize when something was just a loose connection instead of impending disaster. Evan was a natural teacher, patient, encouraging, never once making her feel foolish. Lottie took notes on a scrap of receipt paper, her handwriting sprawling in earnest. You really don't have to, Evan said one day, glancing at her notes. I want to, she insisted. If I write it down, I'll remember. He smiled at that, the kind of smile that made her stomach flutter in ways she tried very hard to ignore. One chilly afternoon, they worked side by side in the fading light, replacing a worn-out battery. Lottie fumbled with a stubborn bolt, frustration knotting her brow. Here, Evan said gently, covering her hand with his. He guided her grip, steady, patient, and together they loosened the bolt. Their hands lingered for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, a spark flaring quietly in the space between them. Lottie felt the heat rise to her cheeks but didn't pull away immediately. Neither did Evan. Finally, he cleared his throat and stepped back, giving her room to breathe. You're a quick learner, he said, his voice a shade rougher than usual. Lottie grinned, lifting her greasy fingers triumphantly. Maybe I missed my calling as a mechanic. Evan chuckled. Don't worry. We're always hiring. The easy banter, the light in his eyes. It filled a hollow place inside her she hadn't realized was still aching. That evening, as she walked back to her motel with oil under her nails and a smudge on her cheek, Lottie felt something new take root inside her. Not just attraction, though that was undeniable. Not just gratitude, though she owed Evan more than she could say. It was deeper than that. It was respect. It was admiration. It was the slow, careful stitching together of trust. For the first time in years, she wasn't just being rescued. She was learning to rescue herself. And Evan, quiet, steady Evan, was showing her how, one small, patient lesson at a time. The first warnings came on a Sunday afternoon, soft and subtle, like a whisper at the edge of town. Gray clouds gathered over Maple Hollow, casting long, uneasy shadows across the sleepy streets. The warm breeze that had carried the scent of apples and cinnamon the day before shifted, turning cool and restless. Inside the bookstore, Lottie restocked a display of autumn-themed novels, glancing occasionally at the window as the light dimmed. Edie appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Storm's brewing," she said, her voice laced with concern. "Not just a sprinkle either. News says it could get nasty." Scout, the golden retriever, whimpered and pressed himself against the counter, as if he too could feel the air thickening with tension. Lottie set down the last book and wiped her palms against her jeans. "I'll close up early," she said. "Better to be safe." Edie nodded. "Good girl. I'm heading home. You need anything, you call me, you hear?" "I will," Lottie promised. She watched Edie bustle out into the wind, her frame small but resolute against the brewing storm. Lottie busied herself with locking the till, stacking chairs, and securing the front windows. The clock above the counter ticked louder in the unnatural hush. The streets had emptied. Shops pulled their awnings down. Porch lights flickered to life across the square. The world braced itself, holding its breath. Lottie slipped into her jacket and grabbed her bag, ready to dash back to the motel before the skies broke open. But when she stepped onto the front stoop, the heavens opened in a sudden, furious torrent. The rain fell in sheets, drumming against the pavement so hard it seemed to vibrate through the soles of her boots. Lottie hesitated under the overhang, heart pounding. The motel was 3 blocks away, a short walk on a good day, an eternity in a storm like this. She considered waiting it out, but the forecast had promised hours, maybe longer. She pulled her hood up, tucked her bag tighter against her body, and stepped into the storm. The cold was immediate and vicious, seeping through her jacket, plastering her hair to her cheeks. Each step felt heavier, the wind fighting her like a living thing. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the town in jagged bursts of white. Thunder rolled so loudly it rattled the windows. Halfway down the block, her foot slipped on a slick patch of sidewalk. She caught herself against a lamppost, gasping, soaked to the bone. Tears stung her eyes, though she couldn't tell if it was frustration or rain. She had thought she was stronger now, had believed she could weather anything. But standing there, shivering and small under the violent sky, Lottie felt the sharp sting of helplessness creep back in. She bowed her head against the gale and forced herself forward. One step, then another, and another, until she heard it, the low rumble of an engine cutting through the roar of the storm. A truck pulled alongside the curb, headlights slicing through the downpour. The passenger window rolled down, and Evan leaned across the seat. "Get in!" he shouted over the rain, his voice rough but urgent. Lottie hesitated only a second before yanking the door open and scrambling inside. Warmth enveloped her, the dry, worn interior of Evan's truck, the steady rumble of the heater, the familiar scent of motor oil and cedar. She slammed the door shut, shivering violently. Evan pulled back onto the road with practiced ease, windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the deluge. For a moment they said nothing, the cab filled with the sound of rain hammering the roof. Lottie hugged her arms around herself, teeth chattering. "You all right?" Evan asked, glancing at her. She nodded mutely, biting her lip against the sudden, overwhelming urge to cry. "Your motel?" he prompted gently. "Yes," she rasped. They drove the remaining blocks in tense, huddled silence. At the motel, Evan pulled under the awning, the truck idling. But neither of them moved. Outside, the storm raged, a relentless fury against the fragile world. Inside, something quieter, but just as powerful, stirred between them. "You shouldn't have been out there," Evan said quietly, his hands loose but ready on the steering wheel. "I didn't have much of a choice," Lottie whispered, voice trembling. Evan hesitated, then turned fully to face her. "You do now," he said, the words simple, steady, and somehow infinitely more than they seemed. Lottie looked at him then, really looked, and saw not just the man who had offered help years ago, but the man who kept offering it, without expectation, without judgment. Her heart twisted painfully. "Thank you," she said, her voice cracking. Evan reached into the back seat and pulled out a flannel blanket, handing it to her without a word. The fabric was worn, soft from countless washings. Lottie wrapped it around herself, clutching it like a lifeline. For a moment she simply sat there, breathing him in, the steady presence, the quiet kindness. "I was so sure I had to do everything alone," she admitted, staring at her rain-soaked sneakers. "I thought needing help meant I'd failed." Evan's voice was low and certain. "Needing help just means you're human, Lottie." She let the truth of that wash over her, warmer than the blanket, deeper than the storm. Outside, the thunder rolled on, but inside the cab, it was calm, solid ground in the middle of the tempest. Lottie turned to Evan, her heart pounding for an entirely different reason now. "Would you stay for a little while?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He searched her face for a long moment, as if weighing the layers behind the simple question. Then he nodded. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Lottie believed it. The rain softened by midnight, falling in a steady whisper instead of a furious roar. The motel parking lot shimmered with puddles, reflecting the scattered glow of streetlights like broken pieces of a mirror. Inside Evan's truck, the windows had fogged slightly from their breath, cocooning them in a bubble of fragile warmth. Lottie sat wrapped in Evan's flannel blanket, her hands curled around a paper cup of diner coffee Evan had somehow rustled up. She sipped it carefully, the bitter taste grounding her, anchoring her in the surreal tenderness of the moment. Outside, the storm still prowled, but inside she felt, strangely, safe. No extravagant words had been exchanged, no grand gestures, just the quiet companionship of two people who understood what it meant to weather storms, both outside and within. At some point, Lottie leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at her. She didn't mean to fall asleep, but in Evan's truck, lulled by the steady rhythm of the rain and the low hum of the heater, she slipped into a deep, dreamless slumber. When she woke, the storm had dwindled to a soft mist, and the faintest light of dawn brushed the horizon. She stirred, blinking blearily, only to find Evan still in the driver's seat, awake, alert, keeping silent watch. "You should have woken me," she murmured, voice rough from sleep. Evan shrugged, his expression gentle. "You needed it." Lottie's throat tightened painfully. She clutched the blanket tighter around herself, unsure how to express the gratitude swelling inside her. No one had ever simply sat with her before. Not out of obligation, not out of expectation. Just because. "Thank you," she whispered. Evan offered a small, crooked smile. "Anytime." The motel sign buzzed faintly as Lottie gathered her things. She hesitated with her hand on the door handle, reluctant to step back into the real world and lose whatever fragile, sacred thing had formed between them during the night. Evan seemed to sense her hesitation. "You're not alone anymore, Lottie," he said quietly. Simple words, powerful words, the kind she hadn't realized how badly she needed to hear. She turned back to him, meeting his steady gaze. "Neither are you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. For a long heartbeat, they just looked at each other. Two people battered by life, stubborn enough to still hope for something better. Then Lottie pushed the door open and stepped into the damp morning air. The world smelled clean, washed new by the storm. A few hours later, after a hot shower and a change of clothes, Lottie returned to the bookstore. The town was stirring back to life. Shopkeepers swept debris from sidewalks. Children in bright raincoats splashed through lingering puddles. Life, resilient as ever, marched on. Inside Maple Hollow Books, Edie clucked her tongue as she inspected the leaks near the front window. "Nothing like a good storm to remind you what's solid and what needs fixing," she said with a wry smile. Lottie smiled back, feeling the truth of those words settle into her bones. As she stacked books and righted displays, her mind wandered. Again, to Evan. She replayed the night over and over. The warmth of the truck, the steady comfort of his presence, the quiet promise in his voice. It terrified her, how much she wanted to trust it. And yet, it also thrilled her, like the first deep breath after being underwater too long. Later that afternoon, Evan walked into the bookstore, a little damp from the lingering drizzle, a hesitant smile on his lips. Lottie's heart did an undignified little leap. He carried a small cardboard box, which he set carefully on the counter. "What's this?" she asked, wiping her hands on a cloth. Evan rubbed the back of his neck, a faint flush creeping up his neck. "Thought maybe you could use some backup supplies. For emergencies." Inside the box were practical things: a flashlight, a first aid kit, a portable phone charger, a rain poncho. Nothing romantic, nothing extravagant, and yet it might have been the most thoughtful gift anyone had ever given her. Lottie stared at the contents, a lump rising in her throat. "You didn't have to," she began. "I wanted to," Evan said simply. Their eyes met across the counter, and Lottie felt the air shift between them, charged with something fragile and fierce. She reached into the box and pulled out the rain poncho, shaking it open. "Well," she said lightly, blinking back tears she refused to shed, "at least I'll be the most stylish person in the next storm." Evan laughed, a deep, genuine sound that made something inside her unfurl. "Guaranteed," he said. They spent the next hour together, reorganizing the displays Edie had half-heartedly rearranged. Evan teased Lottie about her chaotic alphabetizing skills. She mock-scolded him for his heavy-handed stacking. It felt easy, natural, as if they had known each other far longer than a few fleeting weeks. At one point, while reaching for a high shelf, Lottie stumbled slightly. Evan caught her by the elbow, steadying her. Their eyes locked. The world around them, the books, the ticking clock, the faint murmur of rain against the windows, fell away. For one dizzying moment, Lottie thought he might kiss her. Part of her desperately wanted him to. But Evan just smiled, slow and sure, and let his hand fall away. "Not yet," his smile seemed to say. But soon, and somehow Lottie realized that was even better. This wasn't a fairy tale sprint toward some grand, sweeping climax. This was something slower, something truer, something worth waiting for. As evening settled over Maple Hollow, casting the town in hues of soft violet and gold, Lottie stood by the front window of the bookstore, watching Evan's truck rumble away down Main Street. The rain had stopped. The air smelled of earth and hope. And for the first time in a very long time, Lottie felt the future unfold before her. Not as something to fear, but as something to embrace. There would be storms again. There always were. But now, she thought, smiling to herself, she had learned something essential. Sometimes the fiercest storms bring the brightest light, especially when you have someone willing to weather them by your side. The days following the storm unfurled in a quiet, golden rhythm. Maple Hollow settled back into itself, its streets washed clean, its storefronts brightened by crisp fall sunlight. Pumpkins appeared on doorsteps. Wreaths of russet leaves hung from shop doors. It was as if the town, too, was breathing easier, lighter after surviving the tempest. Inside the bookstore, Lottie found a new steadiness. Her hands moved confidently over the register. Her laughter came quicker, fuller. She caught herself humming sometimes as she restocked shelves. And every so often, when the bell over the door jingled, her heart would leap, just a little, hoping it would be Evan stepping through with that easy smile and warm, steady presence. Most days it was. One crisp Thursday morning, as Lottie flipped the open sign to face the street, a heavy envelope slipped through the mail slot. Curious, she bent to retrieve it. The return address was stamped in heavy, embossed gold. Whitmore Holdings, Willow Creek. A cold knot twisted in her gut. She tore the envelope open and scanned the letter. It was a job offer, an impressive one. An executive assistant position at one of Preston's corporate branches in a neighboring city. High salary, benefits. A fresh start, neatly wrapped in a tidy, tempting package. No mention of the past. No mention of broken vows or painful histories. Just an opportunity. Lottie sank into the nearest chair, the letter trembling slightly in her hands. Part of her felt absurd for even considering it. She had built something real here. She had found herself again. But another part, the part still tangled in old fears of scarcity and failure, whispered, "This is safer. This is certain." What if her fragile new life here crumbled? What if Evan grew tired of her? What if, when it really mattered, she wasn't enough? The offer sat on the table all day like a silent dare. That evening, after closing up shop, Lottie found herself wandering the quiet streets, the letter folded tightly in her pocket. Without thinking, her feet led her toward the garage by the highway, where the soft glow of overhead lights spilled onto the gravel lot. Evan's truck was parked out front. Through the open bay door, she saw him working beneath the hood of an old Ford, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up, grease smudged across his forearms. The radio played low in the background, some old country song about love and second chances. She stood there unseen for a long moment, just watching. There was something profoundly grounding about Evan, something the glittering, hollow world she'd left behind had never offered. He wasn't a polished promise on fancy stationery. He was real, solid, good. And she realized with a sudden, aching clarity, she didn't want a life built on fear anymore. She wanted a life built on love. Evan glanced up then, wiping his hands on a rag. A smile flickered across his face when he saw her. "You lost?" he teased gently, setting down his tools. Lottie shook her head, heart pounding. "I got a job offer," she blurted, before she could second-guess herself. "From back there, Willow Creek." Evan's smile faded slightly, but he didn't flinch. He just waited. "It's a good offer," she said, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "A safe one." Evan nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "And what do you want?" "Not what makes sense. Not what do your parents expect. Just what do you want?" The simplicity of it stole her breath. "I want," she began, then faltered. How could she explain it? How could she put into words the way this town, this bookstore, this man had stitched her broken pieces back together? "I want a life that's real," she said finally, voice trembling but sure. "I want to stay." Evan's expression didn't change, but something in his posture softened, the tension bleeding from his shoulders. "You don't have to stay because of me," he said quietly. "I know," Lottie said, taking a step closer. "I'm staying because of me." Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to shy away from this moment. Evan reached out then, slow and careful, as if giving her time to pull away. But she didn't. She stepped into his arms, into the safe, solid warmth of him, and felt the last of her doubts fall away like autumn leaves in the wind. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in the simple, breathtaking miracle of each other. No promises were made, no grand declarations, just the steady beat of two hearts choosing, deliberately, fiercely, to move forward together. When they finally pulled apart, Evan brushed a damp strand of hair from her forehead. "Guess I should cancel that backup plan of becoming a rich executive chauffeur," he teased, his voice low and teasing. Lottie laughed, the sound bubbling up from someplace deep and joyful. "You'd hate wearing a tie anyway," she said. "True," he agreed, grinning. They lingered a moment longer, reluctant to break the fragile, sacred peace between them. Finally, Evan squeezed her hand, gentle and sure. "Whatever you build here," he said, "you won't have to build it alone." And with those simple words, Lottie knew she had made the right choice. Not the safe one, not the expected one, the right one. The one her heart had been trying to choose all along. Spring mornings in Maple Hollow were the kind that invited second chances. The world seemed freshly scrubbed, smelling of rain and lilacs, and every sunrise promised something quietly wonderful, just waiting to be discovered, if one was brave enough to look. Lottie stood behind the counter at the bookstore, organizing a new shipment of novels, humming softly under her breath. It had been weeks since she had chosen to stay, to plant her feet firmly in this modest, imperfect little town, and every day since had reaffirmed that she had made the right decision. Not the easiest one, not the safest one, but the one that was finally her own. And in that choice, she had found a kind of peace that no glittering ballroom or polished title had ever offered her. Late that afternoon, Edie bustled into the store, her arms laden with donation boxes. "Spring cleaning," she announced. "Time to clear out the attic. And my conscience. Lottie laughed, rushing to help her. As they sorted through the boxes, they unearthed everything from old travel magazines to a battered copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. At the very bottom of one box, Lottie found a worn leather journal. The spine was cracked, the pages yellowed with age. She opened it carefully, revealing pages filled with neat, looping handwriting. It wasn't a diary exactly. It was more like a collection of thoughts, quotes, and reflections about life, kindness, and the quiet battles people fought every day. One entry caught her eye. Value isn't measured by what you have or what you can offer to the world's applause. It's measured by how you lift others when no one is watching. Lottie traced the faded words with her fingertip, a lump rising in her throat. She thought of Evan, his quiet strength, his steadfast kindness. He had never sought the spotlight, never asked for anything in return. He simply showed up, and in doing so, he had changed everything. That evening, Lottie found Evan at the field where his dream garage was slowly taking shape. The foundation had been poured, and the framework was beginning to rise. Crooked, imperfect, but sturdy, much like them. He was hammering a beam into place when she arrived, sleeves rolled up, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. He looked up, smiling when he saw her. "Hey, stranger." "Hey," she said, breathless from the sight of him, from the overwhelming surge of emotion she hadn't been expecting. She approached slowly, the leather journal clutched in her hands. "I found something today," she said, holding it out. Evan wiped his hands on a rag and took it, flipping through the fragile pages. When he reached the quote she had marked, he paused. He didn't say anything at first, just closed the journal gently and looked at her. "I think it fits you," Lottie said, her voice trembling. "You've built a life, not by chasing after applause or approval, but by being the kind of person who lifts others up, quietly, constantly, without asking for anything in return." Evan shifted, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. But Lottie pressed on. "I spent so long chasing things that looked like worth," she whispered. "Titles, appearances, approval. But you showed me where real worth lives." She reached for his hand, rough and warm in hers. "It's here," she said, pressing his hand over his own heart. "It's always been here." For a long moment, the only sound was the soft rustle of the meadow grasses in the breeze. Then Evan pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, as if anchoring them both. "You're wrong about one thing," he said roughly against her hair. She pulled back, frowning up at him. "I didn't change you, Lottie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You found yourself. You just needed a little reminder of what was already inside." Tears blurred her vision, but she smiled through them. Because she knew he was right. She hadn't been rescued. She hadn't been remade. She had simply been seen, for the first time in far too long. And in being seen, she had remembered who she truly was. They sat together on the edge of the half-built porch as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of gold and rose. Scout trotted up from the woods, dropping a muddy stick at their feet with a triumphant bark. Lottie laughed, wiping her eyes, feeling lighter than she had in years. Evan slung an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "For teaching me that real worth isn't about being perfect," she said. "It's about being present, being kind, being brave enough to stay when things get messy." Evan chuckled softly, resting his forehead against hers. "Messy's my specialty," he teased. She grinned, pressing a kiss to his cheek. "Then we're going to be just fine." And somehow, in that quiet, imperfect moment, with the world still humming with unfinished dreams, Lottie knew they already were. Spring came early to Maple Hollow that year. By mid-March, the first blush of green softened the bare branches. Crocuses pushed stubbornly through patches of melting snow, and the air held a sweet, tentative promise that even after the longest winter, life finds a way to bloom again. Lottie stood on the back porch of the small cottage she now called home, a mug of coffee warming her hands. The cottage sat at the edge of town, overlooking a wide, open field that turned gold at sunset. It wasn't grand or new. It creaked when the wind blew, and the pipes rattled on cold mornings. But it was hers, or rather, it was theirs. Evan's truck was parked in the gravel drive, and inside the scent of fresh paint and sawdust lingered, evidence of their clumsy but earnest efforts to make the place theirs together. Scout, Edie's retired bookstore dog who had somehow adopted them both, dozed in a sunny patch by the door. Lottie smiled, breathing in the quiet peace of it all. She had never imagined her life would look like this. She had imagined polished city apartments, glittering fundraisers, a life polished to a mirror shine. But standing there, wrapped in the morning chill, listening to the low murmur of Evan fixing the rickety fence out back, she knew she had found something infinitely better. A life that was messy and imperfect, but real. A life built on small kindnesses and stubborn hope. A life full of quiet miracles. The bookstore thrived through the spring, its windows thrown open to let in the clean, laughing air. Lottie worked the front counter most days, arranging displays, recommending books to wandering tourists, chatting with the regulars who had quickly become something like family. Edie, ever the benevolent queen of Maple Hollow, oversaw it all with twinkling eyes and sharp wit. "You're one of us now," she declared one evening, handing Lottie a key to the shop as if bestowing a knighthood. Lottie accepted it with trembling fingers, blinking back tears. She had never realized how starved she had been for belonging until she found it tucked between second-hand novels and the smell of cinnamon coffee. One Saturday afternoon, Evan appeared at the store with a surprise. He tugged her by the hand, laughing when she protested her dusty jeans and messy hair, and led her through town, past the square, down a dirt road she didn't recognize. At the end of the road stood a wide, open plot of land. Wildflowers bloomed in chaotic patches across the meadow, and a small, half-built structure stood at the center. 4 sturdy walls and the bare bones of a roof. Lottie stared, uncomprehending. Evan stuffed his hands into his pockets, suddenly shy. "It's not much yet," he said, "but I bought it. Figured maybe I could build the garage I always dreamed of. Not just for fixing cars, but for teaching too. Kids who don't have anywhere else to go. Kids who just need someone to believe in them." He glanced at her, uncertain. "I guess I'm saying, I'm putting down roots." Lottie's throat closed up. Tears welled and spilled over before she could stop them. She stepped into his arms without hesitation, burying her face against his chest. "Me too," she whispered. In his embrace, she felt the undeniable, unshakable truth. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were building something beautiful together. Their wedding was simple, just the way they wanted it. On a breezy afternoon in late May, beneath the arching branches of the old oak tree in the meadow, Lottie and Evan said their vows. Edie officiated, wearing a ridiculous floral hat and misty eyes. Scout trotted down the aisle with the rings tied to his collar. The whole town showed up, bearing homemade casseroles and folding chairs, and more love than Lottie had ever known could fit into one place. There were no glimmering chandeliers, no orchestras, no designer gowns. Lottie wore a simple ivory dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, a wreath of tiny wildflowers in her hair. Evan wore clean jeans, a white shirt, and the kind of smile that could melt stone. When they spoke their vows, they promised not perfection or fairy tales. They promised patience, kindness, second chances, and a home, not in a house, but in each other. When Evan slipped the simple silver ring onto her finger, a ring he had made himself in secret, hammering and polishing late into the nights, Lottie thought her heart might burst from the sheer, overwhelming joy of it all. They kissed under the wide sky, the crowd whooping and clapping, and somewhere above a flock of birds lifted into the blue, carrying their hopes higher than they could see. As the sun set, painting the meadow in gold, Lottie stood hand in hand with Evan, looking out over the fields. The air buzzed with laughter, the clink of mason jars, the twang of guitars. Scout chased children through the wildflowers. Edie danced barefoot on the grass. The world felt impossibly wide and achingly intimate all at once. Lottie leaned her head against Evan's shoulder. "Do you think," she asked softly, "that it's possible to have more than one miracle in a lifetime?" Evan kissed the crown of her head, pulling her closer. "I think if you're lucky," he murmured, "kindness makes 100 miracles, maybe more." She smiled, eyes blurring with happy tears, because she knew he was right. The miracle wasn't just surviving heartbreak. It wasn't just finding love again. It was the kindness that stitched broken people back together. The small, stubborn goodness that kept the world turning. The quiet, everyday bravery of choosing hope, even after everything. Lottie closed her eyes, breathing it all in. the laughter, the light, the simple, extraordinary wonder of starting over. And she knew deep down in the place where all real knowing lives that she had finally come home. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Where in the world are you watching from? Feel free to share your reflections in the comments.